word of the Lord was rare in those days. You heard that right at the beginning of that reading from 1 Samuel. The word of the Lord was rare in those days. Not rare as in an undercooked steak. Though I admit that's my bias. I'm married to somebody who wants her steak to still have some roux left in it. We're not talking about that kind of rare. Instead, we're talking about rare as in scarce or hard to find. Now, of course, literally, that was not true. The ancient scrolls were where they always were. The priests knew where the scrolls were. The people knew where the scrolls were. They even brought them out during worship and read from them, but nobody paid attention. The word of the Lord was rare in those days. Rarely heard and perhaps rarely seen. It's said in the story that the old priest Eli was almost blind now. And no doubt they were talking about his physical blindness, but they were also talking about something else. His blindness also described the way he was looking at his own sons. He was not able or not willing, perhaps, to see what his sons had become. His sons were priests because their dad was a priest. That's how it went in those days. But their blasphemy had perverted the priestly role. And old Eli, their father, the old priest, had turned a blind eye to their behavior. And so the word of the Lord was there all the time. But the one who ought to see it had become blind. The one who should have discerned what was right and true and holy refused to see it. Eli, who should have seen and should have known, refused to see and refused to know, which rendered the word of the Lord invisible and inaudible. Not because the word had disappeared, but because those who should see and who should hear did not see and did not hear. And so the word that should have been somehow transforming their life, the word that should have somehow been life-giving and life-renewing, simply stopped speaking. You probably know how that is. You probably have experienced it. Your partner stops listening to you, or your kids stop listening to you, or your coworkers stop listening to you, the political leaders stop listening, and so you stop talking because there's no point in talking if nobody will listen. And pretty soon the gap starts to widen between you and them because nobody is speaking to each other, nobody is listening to each other, and the gap gets bigger and bigger and bigger until finally there is no way to bridge the gap anymore. And so the connection breaks down and the relationship collapses and everybody goes their own way. You know what that's all about. You've had tastes of it, and so have I. And it sounds familiar in a lot of other realms, too. Washington is going one way, and Springfield is going another way, and Waseca is going a third way. The school board, and the town council, and the courthouse. Nobody listens anymore. Nobody listens to the voice of reason. Nobody listens to the voice of tradition. Nobody listens to the voice of faith. Is it any wonder, then, that the words worth listening to have become rare these days? So we come to Samuel. Samuel is a boy, a mere boy, but he's the hope for the future, isn't he? That's what we say, isn't it? Our children are the future. Our children are the future of the church. Our children are the future of the community, of the nation. Our children are the future, and if we lose our children, we lose our future, don't we say? But what if our children turn out to be as blind and as deaf as we are? Samuel isn't there yet, of course. Samuel does not yet know the Lord. Samuel does not yet know the Lord, and the word of the Lord has not yet been revealed to Samuel. Now, that's not Samuel's fault. He is not yet like the sons of Eli. Samuel is just young. Too young to know, too young to recognize the voice that calls to him in the darkness. And so if Samuel is going to figure any of this out, somebody has to help him. Somebody has to tell him, somebody who recognizes the voice, somebody who has heard the word before. Can you imagine what must have been going on in Eli's soul when he began to realize what was going on that night? When it dawned on him whose voice Samuel was hearing. Blind old Eli has to know that this is not going to end well. He has to know that the voice has terrible things to say about him and his son. He has to know that the voice is going to tell Samuel about what is going to happen to his sons and what is going to happen to Samuel in their place. And so it is to his credit that old blind Eli, despite everything, has the courage The courage to help Samuel recognize and discern and listen to the voice that speaks to him in the darkness. It is to his credit that he has the courage to help Samuel hear the word of the Lord. And the word was as bad as Eli feared it would be. The word was so bad that the boy Samuel could not bring himself to speak it the next morning. And so he waited and he waited and he waited till finally the blind old priest had to teach the timid young prophet. The blind old priest had to teach this timid young prophet that when God speaks, you better not bottle up God's word. And Samuel learned the lesson well. You know that for years and years and years after this point, Samuel became a trustworthy prophet, a prophet who spoke many, many words in God's name, and the words did not fall to the ground. Our text told us that. In these days when good words are rare, in these days when God's word is rare, what is your calling? What is my calling? Maybe like old Eli, we've been turning a blind eye to the word. Maybe like old Eli, we've been turning a deaf ear to the word. Do you hear some echoes today? Do I hear some echoes today that remind us of what we used to know? Do we hear some echoes today that call us to help that word find a new voice or a new fresh voice? Or maybe this morning we actually hear a fresh new voice, a voice we haven't heard before, like the voice who is speaking in today's gospel reading. His words were rare in those days too, but rare for a different reason. His words were rare in those days because he had not yet spoken very many of them. This is the very, very beginning of his ministry, so he has not yet spoken many of the words that would become his sermons and his teaching as time went on. His words were rare in those days too. He spoke, and Philip took the risk of believing these new and rare words, took the risk of daring to believe that these were true words, that these were words worthy of heeding. Put yourself in Philip's place. Would you heed the word that this stranger spoke? This stranger, who it seems in the story at least, just walks up to you and out of the blue says, "Follow me." Would you listen to those words? Now, like Samuel, you don't recognize the voice, and there's no Eli around to help you discern what's going on and enlighten you. But he stands there nonetheless in front of you. He stands there, and he expects you to respond. What will you do? What will you say? Or maybe even more difficult to answer. How will you explain your response, whichever response you choose to make? How will you explain your response to somebody who asks you why you did what you did? In fact, that's what happened in the story. Nathanael says to Philip, "You did what? Why would you do such a thing? Don't you know about those folks up there in Nazareth? Nothing of any consequence ever came out of Nazareth. Nobody worth following ever came out of Nazareth. What in the world is the matter with you, boy?" Pretend you are Philip's voice now. How will you defend your choice? How will you explain your choice? What will you say that makes sense? Not much, really. There isn't a whole lot you could say to make all of that make sense. In fact, it seems to me Philip said the only thing that could be said in the situation. He said to Nathanael, come and see. Come and see with your own eyes. Come and hear with your own ears. Because sometimes there aren't any words that can explain it. Sometimes all the second-hand words are pretty much worthless. Eli cannot explain it to Samuel. Philip can't explain it to Nathanael. But when you are face to face with the speaker, when you are ear to mouth with the speaker, when the rare word somehow becomes flesh, suddenly you see things that make sense. And you find yourself following even though you can't quite explain why. And that's when making the word of the Lord less rare becomes your responsibility too. In a backhanded kind of way, maybe this little story helps us understand how that goes. According to the story, the traffic light has just turned yellow in front of them, and the old man who was riding a bicycle down the street stops when the light turns yellow. Even though he might have pushed himself and gotten through the light before it turned red, he stopped and waited because that's the safe thing to do. But this guy in the car was tailgating the guy. He was just furious, honking his horn and screaming in frustration because he hadn't been able to get through there before the light turned red. He's screaming and carrying on and ranting and cursing and flipping the guy off, and he spilled his coffee and he dumps his breakfast sandwich all over the floor of the car, which makes him madder and madder and madder. And as he's going through this long rant, he hears tap, tap, tap on the side, on the window of the car. Turns and looks, and there is a very serious and imposing looking police officer standing there who motions for him to get out of the car and put his hands up. The police officer arrests him and takes him down to the police station. He's searched and he's fingerprinted, locked in a cell. He sits there cooling his heels for several hours, and finally, after quite some time, the officer comes and unlocks the cell, takes the man back to the booking desk, returns all of the possessions that he'd taken from the man, and says to the man that he is free to go. Of course, the man wants some kind of explanation. So the police officer says, "Oh, there has been a mistake. You see, when I pulled up behind your car, while you were blowing your horn and flipping the guy off and cussing the blue streak, I also noticed the 'What would Jesus do?' bumper sticker, and the Choose Life license holder, and the Follow Me to Sunday School sign in the back window, and that little chrome-plated fish insignia on the back of your car. So I assumed you had stolen the car." Maybe that's the take-home point. Maybe that's the take-home point. If you want the word of the Lord to be less rare, make your behavior match your bumper sticker. With that, confess if you dare what you believe. We use the words of the United Church of Christ Statement of Faith. You will find it in your hymnal inside the front.